Aleph, 41a, and we're at the Gemara. Okay. So we began the discussion, this parak, with the different items that are spoken specifically in Hebrew versus the items that are spoken in any language. And one of those items that specifically has to be in Hebrew is Parshas HaMelech, the reading of the Torah by the king, which we said happens on the 8th year on Yom Tov Sukkot, after the first day of Sukkot. Okay. So the Gemara starts off with a question. The Mishnah says it happens b'Shmini on the 8th day. So the Gemara says b'Shmini Sakadadach. Do you mean that it happens on the 8th day of Yom Tov? That would be what we call Shmini Atzeres. So the Gemara says no. Ema b'Shminis, meaning that it happens on the 8th year of the Shemitah cycle. Okay. Now, if you look at what the Torah writes, it says. What is it? Go ahead, full pasuk here. Wait a second, let me just find it. Aleph. There it is. Okay. Dvarim Lamed Aleph Yud. The pasuk reads as follows: Yitzav Moshe Osim Lemer. Moshe commanded them. Listen closely. Miketz Sheva Shanim, at the end of the 7 years. B'Moyed on Yom Tov. B'Moyed Shnas Shemitah. B'Chag HaSukkos. 1 second. So it's the year after the 7-year cycle. B'Moyed on Yom Tov B'Chag HaSukkos, on Sukkos. B'Voichal Yisrael Erois. So the Gemara explains why you have Torah has to give a very specific description. 41a, and we are on 5 lines in the bottom. B'Kol Hani Lamali, right at the Gemara, but half the line down. Okay, so the Gemara says Tzrichin. It's all these. The verse is very specific nature is completely necessary. Because of Rachmana Miketz. If the Torah would have said at the end of 7 years, 1 second. If it wasn't clear, if it said Miketz at the end, but if I didn't specify Shemitah, it's a Nimnu Mehashta. I would think maybe you count from the 40 years that they were in the desert, and at the end of the 40 years, that's when the king has to read the Torah. In other words, maybe it's the end of a 7-year cycle, but it's not, the 7-year cycle is not tied to Shemitah. So therefore, the Torah has to say, Miketz Sheva Shanim, at the end of 7 years, and that 7-year cycle is the 7 years of Shemitah. There aren't 2 7-year cycles. Because the Rachmana Shemitah, Ikas Rachmana Shemitah, Havamina B'Sayf Shemitah. I would think that at the end of Shemitah means on Shemitah itself. So because the Rachmana B'Mayid, it has to take place in Yom Tov. Because of B'Mayid, if it was just said on Yom Tov, Havamina B'Rei Shaita, it's on Rosh Hashanah. Because the Rachmana B'Chag HaSukkos, it had to specifically mention Chag HaSukkos. It happens on Sukkos. Because the Rachmana B'Chag HaSukkos, Havamina Fili Yom Tov Achron. I would think it could be Shmini Atzeres, the last day of Sukkos. Because the Rachmana B'Voy Kol Yisrael, when everybody comes, Me'aschalta D'Mayid, from when the holiday begins, and that would be on the first day of Yom Tov. So, like the previous Gemara, we saw there's a process of how the Sefer Torah gets passed to the king. What happens is the Shamash takes it out, he hands it over to the Gabbai, who hands it over to the Skan Kohen Gadol. He's the assistant Kohen Gadol, assistant in the sense that if the Kohen Gadol dies, he takes over his place. Hopefully we'll get there today. We'll soon see that the Skan is not really a titled position. I guess practically it's a little like a vice president, except the vice president actually has a position, the Skan doesn't. So there are other title positions. The Skan's position is exclusively in the event the Kohen is incapacitated or dies, he takes over. That's his entire title. So he hands it over to the Skan hands it over to the Kohen Gadol, who hands it over to the king. Okay. So the Gemara says, Shema Mino, we see from here, Cholkin Kavod L'Talmud V'Makom Harav. We accord respect to the student, to the different levels of students, even when the rabbi is present. And again, the king here is sort of the rabbi, and the different levels, the different people are sort of like students. And maybe we saw previously it's a debate whether or not it is appropriate to honor a senior student while the rabbi is present. So the Gemara says no. It's not about honoring the students; it's about honoring the king, and that's why they passed the Torah, through the seniority levels. It shows that everybody is subjugated by the king. The king stands and receives the Torah and reads it sitting down. Agrippas, the final king, he read the Torah standing. Okay. So the Gemara says, Aymed, he stands up to receive the Torah, to take it from the Kohen Gadol. Mechlal, it must be. Then until now, Yoshev, he was sitting. Okay, now, important to understand here. In the first temple, there were kings of the first few kings ruled the entire country. That would be Shaul, David, and Shlomo. And after that, the kingdom was split in two: kingdom of the tribes and the kingdom of Yehuda. They did fight at least two civil wars. We'll discuss it a little bit soon. Regardless, the king of Yehuda was the one who was permitted to sit down in the Azara, and the king of the 10 tribes was not permitted to sit, which is one of the reasons why Menashe was concerned that people would go up to be Eiler Regel. They would see the other king sitting down, and he would have to stand. So therefore, he took the nation and tried to convince them to worship idols, and built idols inside of the area of the 10 tribes, and he told everyone to be Eiler Regel. Their pilgrimage should be to these idols, as opposed to going to Jerusalem. He also put sentries on the roads to prevent anyone from getting to Jerusalem. Okay, now that's all true in the second in the first temple. In the second temple, there really was no king until the Hashmonaich dynasty took over. Hashmonaich dynasty took over the country from the Syrian Greek emperors, and that was after the Nes of Hanukkah. After that, they controlled the country until its destruction, 100 and something years later, 150, 160 years later. Now, the Hashmonaim were Kahanim. As a matter of fact, Talmud relates that God was upset that they did not reestablish a Davidic dynasty. The Kahanim are not kings. The Kahanim are the ones who serve in the temple, and they kept the kingship for themselves. And the Gemara is asking that presumably when we talk about the king reading the Torah, the Hashmonaich kings were also sitting down. And the Gemara asks that the permission to sit was only for Davidic kings. So how could it be that they were sitting down in the Azara? Davidic kings. Shenemar is the first states. King David came and he sat before God. Okay. So evidently you need to be the Davidic king. So how could the Hashmonaim sit? So the Gemara explains the Torah would be read in the Ezras Nashim, where there is no prohibition on sitting down. Okay, Agrippas read the Torah standing. Shafchu, the rabbis praised him. The Gemara says Mechlal the Shaper of it. Evidently, it was the right thing to do. The Gemara asks, Ha'amar Rav Ashi. Rav Ashi taught, Afilu Laman Amar, even according to the opinion that says, Nasi Shemachal Akvayde Kvayde Machal, Melch Shemachal Akvayde Ain't Kvayde Machal. So what does this mean? So a Nasi is the exarch. He's the leader of the people in exile. in a certain sense, there was some amount of power that was given to them. This is true, by the way, not just of the exilarch, but throughout generations, until relatively recently. So you're talking about 300-400 years ago, most Jewish communities had some power. So today, one has the privilege of, one is able to have any citizen of a country can decide to join a Jewish community, a Catholic community, Protestant community, or no community at all. Right? One doesn't have to be part of a community. And this is true if one wants any of the privileges that were typically associated with community, most commonly marriage. Somebody wants to get married, he can get married with a Jewish marriage ceremony, a Catholic marriage ceremony, or no marriage ceremony at all. That's also an option. In up to relatively modern times, it was never the case. The person was always affiliated with the community. He was taxed according to the community that he was affiliated with. And his marital rules were dependent on the community he was affiliated with. So it was the case that the Jewish community, and any community for that matter, in large cities, there could be many communities of different religions, they had some amount of power. They weren't powerless, figureheads. And the exilarch certainly was quite powerful. The emperor gave him, vested him with authority to rule the Jews, basically. And of course, to tax them and hand over the taxes to the king. It was also responsibility of the exilarch. So exilarch did have some ruler-like features, but if he decided to forgive his honor, he was allowed to do so. However, a king, a Jewish monarch, is not allowed to forgive his own honor. He's vested with the honor of kingship, and that honor cannot be forgiven. Shenemar, as the pasuk says, "Saim tasam alecha melech," you should appoint a king upon you. Shtehei maseh alecha, that you're fearful of him. You fear the king. It's not up to a king to abandon the authority of the power vested within him. He doesn't have that authority, that right to do it. And therefore, if the king forgives his honor is not forgiven. It's not his to forgive. It's the honor of the kingship. So the Gemara says in Mitzvah Shayini, the positive commandment to respect the Torah allowed him to fulfill that commandment. He was allowed to forgive his honor. In other words, he wasn't forgiving it to a person. He's forgiving it to God, and that is permitted. Okay. Now the next part. So we learned that Agrippas, what happened was the Chashmonaim that ultimately, I believe it was Herod that wiped them all out. Herod himself was a former slave of the Chashmonaim. He was part of the Chashmonaic dynasty. He had killed out every male leader and grabbed one of their women for his wife. The Gemara says that anyone who says that they are descendants of the Chashmonaic dynasty, you should know that they are slaves, because all the males were killed. Okay, so now Agrippas obviously was a descendant of slaves. He is an heir to the Hashmonaic dynasty through Herod, which means that his mother was Jewish, but he initially, at least at some point, descended from slaves. So it was not appropriate for him to be king. He was effectively a slave. Okay, one second. So in other words, they praised him and they said to him, he got to the point where it says, you shall not appoint a non-Jewish king. And he started crying because he wasn't Jewish. His father was a non-Jew. However, they calmed him down. They said, don't worry, your mother is Jewish, you're Jewish. But that was the wrong thing to do, because despite the fact that his mother was Jewish, he was a descendant of slaves, and he should not have been king. Tana Mishmei Rav Nosson taught, at that moment, the enemies of the Jewish people were marked for extinction. Now, this is a euphemism. It doesn't refer to the enemies. Okay, it's a nice euphemism of talking about the Jewish people themselves. In general, whenever the Gemara talks about the haters of the Jewish people, the enemies usually means it euphemistically. What was the problem? They engaged in chanufa. What do they translate chanufa? Flattering. It's not a complete. Chanufa is much more than flattering. Chanufa is sort of this nepotistic corruption. Okay, and the Gemara to the end of the parak will go through this concept of chanufa, which is sort of lying and flattering those in power to, so that they act favorable with you, much like our political system. Lobbying, I think, is a good translation. Okay. Shechnifu lo agribas. Amar Shimon Chalafta. Shimon Chalafta said, "Miyom shegover agroifa shel chanufa." An egroif is a fist. From when the power of chanufa increased, nisavsu hadinim, the court systems have been corrupted. Miniskalkelu hamaisim, people's actions have been corrupted. Ve'ein adam yachal loymer l'chavere maisi gedolim mimaasecha. Nobody could tell somebody else my actions are better than yours, and the reason for that is because the leadership did not call out those that were entrusted with that were vested with power, and honestly correct them. Instead they just flatter them and continue the corruption. So therefore, that is why sin increases. And therefore, nobody can say to their friends, my actions are greater than yours, because at some level they bear culpability for the fact that they live in a corrupt society, which is an interesting critique and certainly something we should take personally. Dorish of Yehuda bar Marova, V'Tamer of Shimon Pazi, Yehuda bar Marova, and some say it was Shimon Pazi, said, Mutar lahachtef l'rasham ba'el mazeh. Very important. One is permitted to, engage corruptly with rasham, wicked people. Ba'el mazeh, in this world. Shenemar, as the pasuk says, la'yikra oid l'novel nediv. They shall not call a navel, someone who's disgusting, a nediv, a generous donor. It sounds familiar, right? Ulachili, and somebody who's a drunkard, l'yomer shua, they shouldn't call him a gentleman. Okay. In other words, when Mashiach comes, this will stop. We won't call pedophiles donors, right? Or drunkards, we won't call them gentlemen. Evidently, that in this world, if you have to deal with the wicked, it is permitted to be corrupt with them, and therefore one is permitted to provide chanufa to Rishon. Rishon ben Lakish Amar. Rishon ben Lakish says, "Mehacha kir'ois pnei alikim v'atirtzeni." Okay, very interesting. So Yaakov Avinu meets Esav, right? They have this encounter, and Esav says to him, I'm sorry. So Yaakov Esav's out to kill him. Yaakov provides him with all these gifts, and Esav they meet each other, right? Maybe Esav tried to bite his mouth, maybe not. Two explanations in Rashi there. Regardless, Yaakov says to him, "Seeing you, it's like seeing the face of God." Well, hold on a second. It obviously wasn't, right? So that's clearly an indication of chanufa. It's sort of, so you see that you're allowed to have chanufa, this sort of flattering or corruption, toward the wicked people, because it's necessary, because it's the only way you can live. Okay. Upligid Rav Levi. However, this opinion disagrees with the opinion of Rav Levi. The Amar of Levi says, Mashal Yaakov Esav l'mad. What's a good analogy for this discussion between Yaakov and Esav? La'adam shazimain es chaveroi v'hikar v'yishem vakish lahargai. So there's a guy who invites somebody as a guest, and he suspects, he has a lot of suspicions with the fellow. Modern analogies, he's walking down the street, and it seems that somebody's following him. So what does he do? He pulls out a cell phone and he pretends to have a conversation with the CIA, or the FBI or something like that. So what does he do? This guy has his guest in his house. He thinks he wants to kill him. Amar Lois, he says to him, "Tam tafshel zeh," taste of this food. And shani time that I'm tasting, it reminds me shetamti kitafshel shamti beis hamelach. It reminds me of the food that I had at the White House dinner last night. So, you went to White House dinner? It's like, maybe I won't kill you. So Amar, so the guy thinks to himself, Yodalei Malka, he knows the king, Mustafi V'Likotalei. He's going to think twice about killing him. So therefore, this was sort of a trick that Yaakov played on Esav. He says, "Seeing you, it's like seeing the face of God." So Esav thinks to himself, "Wow, Yaakov is seeing the face of God. That's pretty impressive. Maybe it's better not to kill him." So again, obviously, it is a type of chanufa, but it's even less than a regular chanufa. it is a chanufah. Ultimately, it's it's the case that he was saying this to save himself, but he was saying it to save his skin, as opposed to the first case, which is sort of when you know somebody's wicked, you're allowed to play the game, which is also important to know. We live in a society that is quite, we have quite a few wicked people in power,
and especially as Jews, we gotta be careful. We have
Yeah.
to play that game.
Yeah, so Jews in general, Jews were always what they call horse traders. Politically, Jews, traditionally throughout Europe, after Ashkenaz, as far as the Jews, I don't know about, but Ashkenazi Jews, every king wanted to kill Jews or expel them, and the Jews had to horse trade between different political actors and play the game.
Gotta get along with whoever's in power.
Yeah. Rabbi Elazar says, "Kol adam sheyesh b'chanufa, maybe afla island. People that are engaged in this process of chanufa, they bring anger to the world. Shenemar, v'chanife leiv yasimu af. Those that engage in chanufa, they will provide anger. Their prayers are not heard. Shenemar loy yashu ki asram. The verse continues and says, they will not, their prayers will not be listened to. Okay. Gemara goes through some here. Over those two that we've already seen. The next one is, I'm sorry, the first one was af is anger. The next one is as follows: Uber, pregnant. Gehenim is Gehenna, hell. The Yada in his hand. Nida, woman who's menstruant, and Goyla exiled. Those are all the Gemaras till the end of the parak. V'amar Belazar says, even the fetuses curse him. In other words, it's such a repulsive behavior, and obviously this is something that we can all, most of us can relate to in our society. Shenemar, as the pasuk says, he says to the wicked, "You are righteous." Yikavu amim yizamu leumim. He will be cursed by amim, nations. Yizamu, they will also curse him. Leumim. Also, Lu'um is another word for nations. However, what we'll see in a moment, Lu'um could also mean something else. Ve'ein kaiv elaklala. Kaiv is a reference to cursing. Shenemar leikave kel, which is a reference. Bilam says, "I won't curse." God did not allow me to curse them. Ve'ein la'im, the word la'im, which typically means a nation, could also be a reference to fetuses. Shenemar la'im milam yematz. When Rivka is carrying Esav and Yaakov, when Rivka is carrying Esav and Yaakov. She's pregnant with them, and they're fighting together already in the womb, and Shem tells her that these two nations, and he calls them La'im. However, La'im here is obviously a reference to the fetus. So therefore, we see that the despicable nature of Chanufa is such that even the fetuses will curse such a person. Belazar says, anyone who's filled with Chanufa falls into Gehenim, hell. Shenemar, woe is to someone who says evil is good and good is evil. Maksiv Achrov, what is the next verse? Like fire burns a piece of hay, and a small amount of fire will burn the whole thing up. So that's a reference that somebody who is engaged in saying good is bad and bad is good will go to Gehenim. Belazar says, someone who is engaged in Chanufa to his friend, eventually he will be subjugated by him, i.e. the Chanufa ultimately will not help. Even if he doesn't fall into his hands, he falls into the hands of his children. He will fall into the hands of his grandchild. Okay, Shenemar, as the verse states, a little bit of background here. There was a false prophet. Now, false prophets are very unique because it's not so easy to become a false prophet. In order to become a false prophet, you've had to have been a real prophet first. So, real prophet means you've given prophecy 3 times, and obviously 3 unlikely things to happen, and they occurred at the date that you promised that they would happen. And one of those false prophets was Hananiah. Then eventually he decided to end his relationship with God and just started to worship idols and started making up his prophecies. One of the prophecies was that Jerusalem will be, in other words, Jeremiah was prophesizing the destruction of Jerusalem. Hananiah, the false prophet, was prophesizing the reinvigoration of Jerusalem. He promised it would happen within the year. So Jeremiah says to him, Amen. Ken yasa Hashem, yakom Hashem es tevaracha. Now the rule is with prophecy, a good prophecy must come true. If it does not come true, it indicates the prophet who provided it is a false prophet who's executed. Capital punishment for false prophecy. However, a prophecy of doom may not come to pass. If the people repent, God will not necessarily bring the troubles. So Yirmiyah is providing a prophecy of doom. Hananiah is providing a prophecy of reinvigoration. So Yirmiyah says if it happens, it will have to happen. Your prophecy has to happen because God does not commit to provide a good thing to a prophet and renege on that. So therefore, it must happen.
Definitely, it was said not to prophesy good things. Right?
Well, it would have correct, but either way, you wouldn't be certified. The only way, there are two ways to become certified as a prophet. One is that a certified prophet says that you're certified, or number two, that you prophesy three times and they come to bear, whether to good or to bad. Although if you prophesize for a negative event and it did not come to bear, it does not necessarily prove you're not a prophet. Okay. Anyway, so Hananiah is this. Okay, but whatever. Anyway, regardless, Hananiah provides this prophecy of reinvigoration, and Yirmiyah says, "If only." Okay, and that if only was too much. He should not have said if only because he knew it was false, and he should have that constituted chanufa. He said, "If only God will do what you said." And eventually, Yirmiyah also told Hananiah that if it does not come to bear, you will die this year. And Hananiah did die that year. He died right before Rosh Hashanah, right before the new year. It's very interesting, very cunning man. He refused to be buried until after Rosh Hashanah, so that people should think that he died after Rosh Hashanah, and Yirmiyah's prophecy was wrong. Very pathetic behavior. Anyway, what happened? Eventually, a couple of years later, Vayhihu b'Shar Binyamin, Yirmiyah got an inheritance. He went to the Shar Binyamin to receive it. V'Sham Bal Pekidais, and there was a century. Shmai, his name was Uriah ben Shalmiah ben Hananiah, the grandson of Hananiah. He grabbed Yirmiyahu, lamer or Kazdam Atanaifel, you're a spy for the Kazdam, the Chaldeans. The Yirmiyah Sheker, and then a Neifel, Al Kazdam, I'm not a spy. Yirmiyahu, and they dragged him and they put him into prison. They brought him to the nobleman and they threw him in prison. Okay, so he did. So because of that sort of minor chanufa to Hananiah, which was sort of like, if only, I wish, that was too much. And therefore he ended up being thrown in prison for it. A community that's filled with chanufa is maos, it's repulsive like anida. Shenemar ki adas chanof galmaid, because a nation of chanufa is a galmaid. What does galmaid mean? They call a woman who's a nida, who's menstruant, galmuda. My galmuda. What does the word galmuda mean? Gemula mebaila. It means gemula. Gemul means to wean. Like vayigamal is Yitzchak. Rivka weaned Yitzchak. So therefore, in a certain sense, a woman who's a nida is gemula mebaila. She's weaned from her husband. That period. Rabbi Elazar says, "Kol ish sheyesh b'chanufa l'seif goyla." Any congregation that's filled with chanufa eventually goes into exile. Siv hacha ki adas chanaf and galmaid, because a nation of chanaf is galmaid. Siv hasam, it says elsewhere, v'amarta b'vavecha, and you'll say to yourself, miyo adlias ela, who birthed these? V'ani shchula v'galmuda, and I was barren and galmaid, goyla v'sura, exiled and oppressed. So we see here that the word galmuda can be used in reference with exiled. Therefore, a nation it's filled with chanufa will be exiled. Amar Yirmiyah, this is a pretty scary one. Amar Yirmiyah Barabba said, "Arba kitais ein mekavan pnei shchina." There are 4 categories that do not receive God's presence. And by the way, this is a halachic ruling, and they are kat leitzim, the kat of scoffers. They scoff at it. They scoff at any attempt for reproach. The kat chanifim, the people that engage in chanufa. The kat shkarim, the people that engage in lies. The kat mesaber el shenhara, and those that gossip on their friends. Kat leitzim, the group of scoffers. God removes His hand from those that scoff. Kat chanifim, the group of chanifim, because in front of God there is no chanufa. Chanaf yava. In other words, in front of God there's only truth. There's no None of this. They call this a loose term. They call it regulatory capture. Such a euphemistic term that typically describes chanufa, lobbying. Kachgarim, the siv dover shkarim yikin leneged. Someone who speaks falsehood has no place in front of me. Hat misapri lashon hara, the group that speaks out lashon hara, the siv ki loy kel chafetz rasha ata, loy yigor chara, because God does not desire evil. He does not allow wickedness to stay before him. Tzadik ata Hashem, God is righteous. Lo yogor b'migor chara, there will not be evil gossip that's spoken one another. Will not be in front of his presence. All these people lose their portion to Elam Haba, the world to come. Hadron Alach Elin Amarim, and that concludes the parak of Elin Amarim. Let's begin the next parak. Battle time. Okay, Meshuach Malchama is the general. Meshuach Malchama is a Kohen. Okay, this is the 5-star commander of the army's general, or what they call the Joint Chief of Staff. Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Yeah. Because there is no 5-star general. Unless we were engaged in war. Anyway, so Meshuach Malchama, he's a Kohen and he's the highest general. It's an appointed position. He's been appointed as Joint Chief of Staffs. Okay, but so what happens? He's telling the people. He's when he's introducing the conscripts, he makes the following statements, and we'll learn about that. Meshuach Malchama, while he's speaking to the congregation, to the conscripts, the military, B'Lashon HaKodesh Medaber, he would speak in Hebrew, in Lashon HaKodesh, the holy tongue. Shenemar, V'Haya ki karovchem el Malchama. When you draw near to battle, V'Nigesh HaKohen Zeh Kohen Meshuach Malchama. The Kohen steps forward. He's the Kohen, the general. V'Dibur Ala'am, he speaks to the conscripts, B'Lashon HaKodesh in Hebrew. And he tells them as follows: Shema Yisrael, listen, you're going to do battle with your enemies, not with your brothers. Lo Yehuda al Shimon, v'lo Shimon al Binyamin. Yehuda is not fighting with Shimon. Shimon's not fighting on Binyamin. Shem Tivlu biyadam yirachmu. Because in the cases of civil war, even though they captured and ultimately had to kill soldiers of the Jewish soldiers, effectively from other tribes. But when they were captured, Yerachmu, they were compassionate on them. Shenemar, as the verse Yerachmu Aleichem, they're compassionate on them. Shenemar, as the verse states, Veiku Anashim Asher Nikvu B'Shemes, V'Yachziku B'Shevya, V'Choma Rameim, Albishim and Ashol, V'Albishim and Elam. They captured these people with all their stuff, and they gave them clothing, they gave them dress, V'Yachilim V'Yashkom, they gave them food and drink, V'Yasuchim, V'Yinahalim, V'Chamerem, V'Chol Koshel, V'Yavim Yericha Eretz Morim, Eitz Lachechem, Yeshuv Shomer. Anyway, they captured them, and eventually they brought them back and gave them back to the other tribes during the Civil War. And that was because it was a civil war. Typically, in battles of yore, every man was executed. Potentially subjugation would be a lighter punishment, but that wasn't typically offered. Virtually every male was killed. The kids were the slaves. You don't want to go with grown males who at any point can betray you. Okay, if you will fall into their hands, they will have no compassion on you and they'll kill you. Your heart should not be weak. You shouldn't be fearful, and you shouldn't shake. What does this mean? Your heart shouldn't get weak because of the stomping of the horses or the banging of the swords. Because of the noise of the shields that were banging together, the shifas hakalgasin and the helmets that were crashing into each other. Don't be fearful from the noise of the battle. They called tzvachos. Don't shake because of the screams of battle. That today battle is also quite noisy, but the olden days battle was a very noisy affair. All the helmets and the shields were banging into each other, and each military would try to create a noise to scare the other. Because God is going before you. They come with the triumph of men, of flesh and blood. But you come with the triumph of God. And the Gemara explains, Plishtim Boban is Cheneshal Goliath. What gave the Plishtim confidence that they would win the battle? Goliath. Goliath was he was a giant. He was a large person, and he was a powerful war fighter. Maha Yisaifa, what was his end? L'seif nafal b'cherev. He fell to the swords. Right, King David, when he was young future King David, chopped off his head with a sword. V'naflu imai, v'naflu amai, and then his nation fell as well in battle. Bnei Ammon banu bnei Tzchena shel Shoivach. The children of Ammon came with the their battle leader Shoivach. Maha Yisaifa, what was his end? L'seif nafal b'cherev. Ultimately, Shoivach was the top general. Ultimately, he fell to the sword and he died. And his nation fell. You are not like this. Because God goes before you to fight for you, and he will win your battles. This is the group of the Aron, the Ark of the Covenant was brought into battle. That would lead them to battle, and that was sort of the physical manifestation of God's presence, which accompanied them. God's spiritual presence accompanied them to battle as well. Stop here. Okay. Great morning.
Make it a great one.
Yeah.